Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Amy Littlefield, the author of Killers of Roe, my investigation into the mysterious death of abortion rights. This is her first book, and she is a correspondent for The Nation and has also contributed to the New York Times opinion page. Amy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Evan.
Before we get rolling, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. More than 25 years ago now, I was sitting in a high school English class when the teacher was weighing in on the potential impact of the 2000 election. She said if George W. Bush, the social conservative, won the election, he could appoint a justice that could swing the court. And as she put it, we could lose Roe v. Wade. That was the first time I realized that rights or policy wasn't set in stone in some previous time, the 50s or what have you, that rights and policy are always evolving. She could have chosen any policy to be worried about: campaign finance, guns, affirmative action, all of which would be impacted by future courts. But abortion for her was the top concern. So, Amy, I want to start with, at what point did abortion become not just about ending pregnancies, but a symbol for how much freedom women had?
Yeah, that's a great question to start with. And I love that story because I think for so many people, Roe v. Wade did feel set in stone, right? And yet there were these moments, and the moment you're referring to is one of them, where it became clear, oh my gosh, it's only, a Supreme Court stacked with a lot of anti-abortion men who stand between, this fundamental right and the loss of it. Um, so, in the book, Killers of Roe, I really trace the sort of manufacture of abortion as a political issue. And of course, before Roe v. Wade, abortion was still commonplace. It still happened. It just could be very risky if you didn't have the money to pay for a safe provider, right? There was this divide in the landscape of abortion access before Roe v. Wade that continued after Roe v. Wade in different ways, which was if you're a wealthy woman, you can probably pay to leave the country, or you can find a private, OBGYN who's going to manage to find a way to give you an abortion in a hospital safely. And for people who were poor, they died. And often those deaths were very painful and prolonged and awful.
But was it state by state?
It was state by state. States began sort of liberalizing their abortion laws, right, in the 60s and 70s. And so in the lead up to Roe v. Wade, it depended also in part on where you lived and whether you could travel to a state like New York that had, legalized abortion before other places. So that was sort of the landscape that we were dealing with before Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade legalizes abortion nationwide. And that's a huge step. But pretty quickly, social conservatives who had already been mobilizing against abortion start mobilizing against this ruling. And some of them are really catalyzed, of course, by this, legalization of abortion nationwide. The very early iteration of the anti-abortion movement was predominantly Catholic, right? It was Catholic activists who followed the teachings of their church to a T, which, side note, most Catholics don't, right? Most Catholics use birth control. Many Catholics have had abortions. Many lay Catholics are out of step with these sort of unattainable teachings of the Catholic Church on sex and contraception. But for the few faithful activists who did, they sort of led the early iterations of the anti-abortion movement and the early victories. Then in the late 1970s, early 80s, we start to see the mobilization of evangelicals as a really important political group. And we start to see Republican strategists like Richard Viguerie, who I interviewed for the book, scratching their heads and saying, we could really divide up the Democratic coalition. We could really peel off some conservative Catholics if we start talking about abortion as a political issue. Now, at the time, Republicans who were about to have, spoiler alert, this huge victory with the election of Ronald Reagan, right, which we take for granted now, but they had to figure out how to bring it about in the 1970s. They were creating this sort of strategy to try to get enough of a coalition together to win a presidential election. And, they had fiscal conservatism, right? No one should have to pay for the things the poor people need, is how I like to summarize that. And then they also had, economic or foreign policy in addition to the economic. So, we should have defeat communism abroad, and they had this hawkish sort of foreign policy. But that wasn't enough to kind of get enough of a voting base that they needed. And so they created what Richard Viguerie refers to as the third leg on the stool of conservative power, right? And that was social conservatism, that was abortion. And also, opposing the rights of LGBTQ people and kind of the notion that women belong in the home, which is, having another resurgence today. But so that was sort of the beginning of abortion going mainstream as this political issue that the Republican Party would use to get elected time and time again. And then, of course, the Republican Party would reward the anti-abortion movement, which has always represented a tiny minority of voters, actually. It just was part of the coalition that was needed to win, and rewarding them by, appointing Supreme Court justices who were, picked specifically for their opposition to Roe v. Wade.
We're going to get more into the public policy and the politics, but I want to go back even before America. Take us back as far as you can. What are the earliest documentations of how women ended pregnancies?
Oh, great question. I'm so glad you asked this. I mean, abortion has existed as long as humans have existed, right? Because for all of human history, there have been women, people who are pregnant who, get pregnant and can't be. And in the early days, of course, it was done with herbs. It was done with, objects that were often unsafe. One of the stories that Renee Bracey Sherman and Regina Mahone tell in their book, Liberating Abortion, is about enslaved women in the United States who would use herbal methods to bring about an abortion as a form of kind of resistance against the fact that if they did have children, those children were going to be commodified. They were probably going to be separated from them. And so within this extremely oppressive system, right, Renee and Regina write about abortion as this sort of form of resistance and rebellion against the commodification of enslaved children. So there are documented cases of it happening then. Um, there's some great stories about Madame Restell, the abortion provider, who was this sort of flamboyant figure, providing abortions in the United States in the 19th century, and doing so really out in the open and getting very wealthy off of it. And it was only when Anthony Comstock, the post office inspector and anti-vice crusader, kind of got a hold of the fact that abortions were happening in a commonplace way and folded it into his agenda, which was also about cracking down on pornographic drawings being sent through the mail, and other, things he considered filthy and lewd, that put a stop to people like Madame Restell who are out there providing abortions. But there was a time in American history where abortifacient methods were advertised commonly in newspapers, right? You would pick up the paper and there would be a coded reference to pills that would help bring down your menses, or things that people understood exactly what it meant. As is the case today, attempts to regulate and ban abortion uh, have always been cowed by the fact that people who need abortions get very creative, and the market is always there to meet that creativity.
So you say that the final step, excuse me, you say the final step in the plot to end abortion rights took place when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, that it was a plot that, as you put it, had been assembled over many years. But first of all, for those of us who have had to read Supreme Court opinions as part of our jobs, they're seldom fun to read and often long-winded. And sometimes the language is a little bit coded. What did Roe v. Wade decide constitutionally, and what was the reasoning?
And thank you, Evan, for doing that good work. It's a lot.
It's not good work. It's right.
That hard yet
Yes.
important
Hard. Yeah,
work.
that's right. That's right. That's right.
We know most people are not going to read these opinions, right? And so we need people like you doing the service of reading them and parsing them.
Oy.
Um, but so Roe v. Wade basically legalized abortion nationwide up to a certain point, and it struck down the state by state laws restricting abortion that were in place at that time. And it created a trimester framework, basically. So it said abortion was legal and you couldn't, heavily restrict it in the first trimester of pregnancy. And then in the second trimester, the state could impose some restrictions. And in the third trimester, the state could ban it outright, right? So after the point of fetal viability, which is kind of a moving and invented thing because it depends on technology that's available, it depends on the individual fetus. But this was sort of the rough framework. Not that it wasn't open to contestation. And in fact, laws and policies immediately began to challenge those things, and courts, moved around what restrictions can you have? And is it okay to say that there's a 72-hour waiting period, or does that constitute, too much of a restriction? And what about forced ultrasound laws? And what about this? And can we propose that? And, the anti-abortion movement was really incessant in sort of testing what Roe would allow. And then in 1992, the Planned Parenthood v. Casey decision allowed further restrictions on abortion from the states as long as they didn't constitute what the court called an undue burden. And so again, what's an undue burden? And, who does that apply to? For low income people, abortion had been off limits in many states for many years. And so it was sort of always up to the courts to interpret what um, the Roe v. Wade decision and Planned Parenthood v. Casey would allow and what they wouldn't.
And so what was the constitutional reasoning? What was the sort of piecemeal argument that they put together about how abortion and privacy were found in the Constitution, even though there's not exactly an amendment, or there's several amendments that speak to these things?
Right. There's no right to abortion written into the Constitution, unfortunately. The founders, all those white guys, so many years ago, apparently just didn't have it top of mind. I mean, there's some other things they overlooked.
Yeah.
We could talk about the fact that some of them were slave owners, but yeah, so it was around this right to privacy. There had been some precedent for this around contraception. Again, something that was widely being used, right? And widely needed. And yet there wasn't really a law or a precedent to say, gee, is this something that people should have a constitutional right to or not, right? And so it sort of also fell into this category of privacy. And I think partly it's that the Supreme Court was looking at the changing norms and changing attitudes of the time, right? Courts do respond to the societies that they're a part of, and seeing what was happening, which was that states were beginning to liberalize their laws in recognition of the fact that women were dying, right? Um, and so, for those of us who believe that the Constitution and the law can be a shifting and living thing, I don't think it's too shocking that the justices were able to look at the Constitution and say, I think there's a right to privacy here. And I think that abortion as well as contraception fall under that right to privacy and people's ability to make, decisions. Um, what was, of course, something that feminists really took umbrage with in the way that the decision was worded is that it really was concerned with the sort of privacy between a doctor and a patient, right? And that there was a huge focus among the male members of the court who crafted this decision around, a doctor's ability to be involved in the decision and a doctor's ability to make the call of whether an abortion was really needed. What's interesting today, of course, with a lot of abortions being by medication and self-managed, is the doctor has been sort of taken out of the equation in many of the abortions that are happening today. But that was sort of the early, quite patriarchal, interpretation of where the right to choose could be found in the Constitution.
I don't want to blow your spot up here, but I was reading your book and it says that you once believed that abortion was murder. So, what can we learn from your own story about how such hard and fast views are formed amongst Americans?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I was anti-abortion as a young teenager. I can remember the feeling of feeling so sure that abortion was murder, so sure that it was wrong, and feeling really comforted by the certainty of that decision. Like I felt like this is when I was coming of age politically, when I was starting to learn about,
I mean, you're
you
talking
know,
15, 16 years old here.
or
Yeah.
even younger, 13,
Oh,
14.
okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And, it was when I was starting to, we were starting to have political debates like in social studies class, right? And I remember arguing the pro-life position in a debate in social studies class and being like, this is really easy. I don't even need any arguments because it's just abortion is murder. That's the only argument I need. And anything the other person comes back with, I'm going to say, well, it's murder. You can't do it.
There's
It
somebody in
was
that
like,
who is in that class right now holding up this book going, is this the same Amy? What?
yeah, I know. Well, I hope they enjoyed it. Yeah, it is. I mean, it was, I remember saying to my best friend at the time, like, you can change my mind on anything, but not this. And I think that's what was so appealing about it, honestly, because like,
There's comfort and safety in just declaring it.
yes, in an absolute opinion, right? And I think it was sort of that way for the country at times, right? I mean, the 60s and 70s, things are changing. People are forcing you to have conversations about race, forcing you to think about social justice, forcing you to think about gender roles. And it's like, it's very comforting to cling to something that feels absolute and sort of anchor yourself to that. And it helps if you believe in a church authority that's saying, like, yep, this is the absolute truth. It's, written down right here. And so I wasn't raised in a religious home. In fact, my parents were pro-choice and kind of baffled by what was going on with me. Um, but but it was, I remember sort of clinging to that belief. And then what happened is that a teacher of mine gave me a copy of Susan Brown Miller's Against Our Will, the like radical 1970s text about rape. And I was completely mesmerized by it and horrified by it. And it changed my life. It made me a feminist. It sort of gave me a framework to think about some of the perceptions and feelings I had around women's rights, around what I wanted for my own future. And that was a slippery slope. Once I thought maybe rape victims should be able to make a decision about their bodies, it wasn't long before I realized everyone should have that right and that determination. But I think I can relate still to anti-abortion activists in some way because I remember the comfort and the certainty that came from that conviction when I had it myself.
I'm kind of kicking myself here. I should have asked this next question after the Constitution question, but I want to ask. We hear all the time about the religious aspect of this and what the Bible says, and I want to know, what does the Bible say about abortion?
Nothing, Evan.
Nothing.
Zero.
Nothing.
Zero.
But it also, the Constitution also doesn't say a talk about abortion. So where are they gleaning this from?
Well, okay, but there are a couple Supreme Court justices many years ago who would have said that the Constitution does indeed talk about abortion when it talks about this right to privacy and so
Gotcha.
forth. So,
So yeah,
in the
yeah.
same vein, right? It's funny. I was reading the Gospel of Life, the Catholic encyclical on anti-abortion teaching, and it acknowledges that the Bible doesn't say anything about abortion, right? So I think even some of the religious leaders, now again, there are people who read between the lines who say, well, in this teaching here, it says this, and so therefore that means abortion is wrong. There are all sorts um, of passages that abortion opponents will point to. Oh, before I, knew you, I loved you, I knit you together in your mother's womb. These kinds of passages that are often quoted to say, like, that there's a recognition of unborn life in the Bible. You know, um, I'm certainly not going to go head to head with anyone on interpretations of the Bible, but you're right, that there is a sort of reading between the lines that has happened among religious conservatives and certainly the hierarchy of the Catholic Church to say, these passages do point to, an opposition to abortion that comes from on high. I mean, I think there's a lot in the Bible that, people choose to ignore or emphasize for their own purposes.
One of the tenets, constitutional amendments, if you will, of broadcasting school is that you don't ask more than one question at once. But I'm about to do that, and I'm going to throw a few questions at you. So, but they're all related to the same thing. So, you can answer this how you think is most useful. But I want to just ask about the statistics here. What do the stats show about how many American women get abortions? And then I would just ask, what percentage are because the woman, for whatever reason, would just rather not have a baby? What percentage are done by those who have a medical condition? And those came to light, especially after Roe v. Wade was overturned, where women got very sick and some died because of that. So I'm just curious about the percentages of that, desire versus medically necessary according to a doctor. And then can we also break down the statistics by beliefs? In other words, do we know for sure how often anti-choice women, just statistically speaking, eventually there's going to have to be some sort of Venn diagram there, would make the choice to have an abortion themselves? I'm curious about that. It's too
I'm great.
much. I mean, this
Yeah,
is
I
why
know.
this is why they do it this way. It's don't ask more than one question at once. But I've done that, so I
Listen,
threw a lot there. But
I'm
maybe just start.
grateful you
Yeah.
took long enough to ask it that I could look at my notes,
Okay. Perfect.
which is always helpful.
Yeah. I mean, I
Um,
mean, just if you want to do the first one, it's what do the stats say about?
Yeah, it's about a million women a year that we know of who have abortions. It is very hard to count, especially in this day and age, because a lot of abortions are happening because someone from a community support network passes a packet of pills to another person, or because someone in New York mails pills to someone in Texas. Now, when that happens among activists, it's not being counted. When it happens because a clinician in a state that has chosen to protect abortion access in a so-called shield law state, like New York or Massachusetts, where doctors have been empowered by their state officials to feel protected when they mail abortion pills into states like Texas, where it's banned, those are being counted. And so we know that basically the number of abortions has gone up rather than gone down since we lost the constitutional right to abortion, which is a remarkable statistic. And that's because the way that people are having abortions has changed. So two-thirds of abortions, probably more, are being done with medication at this point rather than with a procedure performed in a clinic. That's, very different than in the years, immediately after the Roe decision. Um, and when we didn't have, abortion medication. So we know that the reasons why people have abortions, we tend to, honestly, the stories that tend to get emphasized are rape and incest and people whose health or life is in danger. That's not the majority of abortions, right? The majority of abortions happen because somebody gets pregnant when they didn't mean to get pregnant and they can't afford the baby, or they're in school and they want to finish school, or there's any range of factors often overlapping in their lives that mean that they can't have a baby. A primary reason that people often cite is financial. And I remember when I worked in a clinic myself many years ago, the most common thing that I would hear from patients is, I can't afford this baby right now. And so I think that, maybe this is like my next book, right? But like the part that we then need to think about as a country is, what does the right to choose actually mean in a situation where our economic system, where capitalism, where the fact that our minimum wage hasn't increased, where lack of access to health insurance mean that people who do want to have babies can't afford to have babies in some cases, right? Now, some of those people who were in the clinic they probably had other reasons why this wasn't the right time for them to have a baby, but I think there are people out there who would like to have more children than they can afford. And, that's another thing that we need to confront as a society, this idea of sort of the right to choose that came about in 1973, as Sarah Matheson points out in her book, Reproduction Reconceived. It sort of coincided with a whole lot of things that were making it harder for people to actually make a meaningful choice, right? Mass incarceration, the economic constraints that would sort of come to a head in the Reagan era that were making it hard for people who needed social services to be able to get those social services. And so, this is a long way around of answering a very statistics heavy question that you had, but basically, enough people have abortions that it's 1 in 4 women or people capable of pregnancy who will have an abortion in their lifetime. And yes, the vast majority of those abortions do not involve some, catastrophic anomaly to the fetus, or, a child who's been raped, and needs to get access to an abortion. And yet, I think those are the stories that tend to make it to the forefront because they pull on people's heartstrings. They're used strategically by the abortion rights movement to try to sway people on the other side. And also because I think they kind of call attention to the contradictions inherent in an anti-abortion point of view, right? If you believe that abortion is murder, well, why is it not murder then if a, child rape victim needs an abortion? Why is it not murder if, the woman has preeclampsia? Like, if you have a consistent anti-abortion position, then I think, but there's been wiggle room because the anti-abortion movement has realized it's very, very unpopular to oppose abortion for rape victims, to oppose abortion for health exceptions or for fetal anomalies and so forth. And so that's why we often have these exceptions built into laws, although in practice they tend to be pretty meaningless.
Do anti-choice women ever admit, maybe privately or in confidential surveys, that they have had an abortion despite their political leanings, and that abortion could be because of a medically necessary situation, or they got pregnant when they didn't want to?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I have every doctor I've ever talked to who performs abortions has a story about someone from the protest line outside, the anti-abortion protesters who stand outside clinics, kind of sneaking her way inside when she needs an abortion herself. There definitely are people who oppose abortion, who justify their opposition to an abortion, and yet will come into the clinic and get one when they need one, or at this point, get them, via mail. And there's a term for this in the abortion rights space, which is no moral abortion except my abortion, right? It's the idea that like, and often those women will come up with, oh, well, this is like okay for me because X, Y, and Z, I needed it or I couldn't
Yeah,
do it or,
I had
yeah,
to, yeah.
yeah.
I want to ask about you in the book a little bit here. How did you build this as a murder mystery? Why did you think this was a good technique for this type of a story?
Yeah, so I'm a murder mystery buff. I love murder mysteries. It's always been like my place of comfort and escapism since that time when I was, 13 years old and taking comfort in anti-abortion ideology. I was also reading Agatha Christie. And what could be more comforting than the knowledge that Hercule Poirot or Miss Marple is going to set everything right by the end? They're going to catch the bad guy. Evil will be extinguished from the world. And also, you get to read these beautiful pastoral scenes of London or St. Mary Mead and lovely cottages and gardens and so that was my sort of escapism. And I found myself when I had my first kid in 2020 returning to that murder mystery escapism. It was the pandemic. I was stressed out and anxious. I wasn't sleeping very much. And that's when my first kid was 5 months old is when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. And sort of the only thing that I could consume in terms of literature was my murder mysteries. Like I went right back to Agatha Christie and I was listening to the audiobooks while I was like feeding my kid in the middle of the night. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and I was so angry, and I knew what was coming, and I was so sad. I knew people were going to die, and so the murder mystery framing really began as a way for me to kind of entice myself to tell what I knew was going to be a really difficult, painful, sad, and raging story. Like I knew I was going to have to sit down with the architects of how we got to where we were. I knew I was going to have to talk to those people. I knew I was going to have to sit with the families of women who had died, preventable deaths as a result of anti-abortion policies. And so I needed a way to sort of draw myself into that story. And I hope it's also a way to sort of draw readers into that story in an approachable way, because reality is pretty tough right now on basically every level. And so it started as a way to sort of bring some comfort and escapism and a little bit of levity to a very serious task.
We have been talking a lot about tenets and amendments here during this show, and another amendment that reporters have to live by is that your feelings are over here on one side and your story is way over here, and the twain don't cross. For you, that's different. How did you build your career as an opinion journalist, given that we are regularly counseled to keep these things separate? How did you sort of, how were you able to mesh those, carrying an opinion, but also making sure that your stories were legit?
I know I broke all the rules I was taught in journalism class. It's very funny. I heard recently from my journalism professor in college who was like, "Oh, you should come to campus and we'll have a conversation." And I was like, "Thank goodness you're not mad at me because in this book I break all the rules you taught me." She was a really, old school, like you can't, she was taught, you don't put bumper stickers on your car. You don't tell people how you're voting. You don't show any political allegiance of any stripe. I think this is partly a generational difference, but I tend to believe like we actually get further in terms of reader credibility when we're clear about where we stand and clear about our point of view. Now, I still have receipts. I still look for evidence. I still, make sure that I quote people accurately. I think that's why the anti-abortion activists that I talk to continue talking to me because I'm nuanced and I'm fair and I quote them accurately. And I'm not looking for like cheap shots by any means. I'm looking for the deep story. Um, but I am clear that I'm pro-abortion rights, and that's how I feel, and that's where I stand. I think sometimes that allows the readers, and it also allows my sources to sort of relax a little bit because they know where I stand. They're not trying to guess. I think a lot of conservatives tend to see all like non-conservative media at this point as being in the same bucket. Like, I don't think there's a lot of difference between CNN or the New York Times and the Nation for them. Like, I think it's all sort of against them in their point of view, right? And so I think when they have a reporter who's like coming to them and saying, like, listen, I have a point of view. If you Google my name, you're going to see I'm pro-abortion rights. However, here's why I'm interested in you. I'm interested in you because you did something really impressive. You defeated Roe v. Wade. Like no one thought you were going to do like that. That's pretty amazing. And I actually think you organize better than the people I agree with. And I want to know how you did it. That tends to be a pitch that appeals to people, I think.
What sources did you use? Who did you talk to for this? And did you have to go into a public archive to tell the story?
I went into a lot of archives. I talked to a lot of people. I talked to everybody that I could. I talked to people on the pro-choice side. I tried to track down all the leaders of groups like Planned Parenthood and NARAL, who were, in charge of those organizations at the time and ask them, what do you think went wrong? What keeps you up at night when you think about the fact that we've lost the constitutional right to abortion? I talked to reproductive justice activists who have been organizing the trenches, people who raise money to fund people's abortions. I talked to everyone I could on the abortion rights side, and I also tracked down everybody I could on the anti-abortion side who would talk to me. I focused my reporting strategy around talking to people who were implicated in the deaths of women, and for each sort of era in the struggle, I focused on the death of a woman from anti-abortion policies. So I started in the 1970s with the death of Rosie Jimenez, who was a 27-year-old mother of a 4-year-old daughter living in McAllen, Texas, trying to put herself through school, cleaning houses on the weekends, finds out she's pregnant, can't get an abortion paid for under Texas Medicaid as she did with her two prior abortions because now the Hyde Amendment has passed. Federal funding for abortion is banned, and she can't get an abortion covered under her Texas Medicaid as a result. And so she goes to an unsafe provider who's cheaper, gets a tube inserted in her cervix, contracts a catastrophic infection, dies 8 days later in a hospital with blood pouring out of her eyes, right? Terrible, horrible, completely preventable death that resulted directly from a public policy. And so I start with that and talk to the men who were involved in her death and the people that you might not necessarily have heard of, right? One of the things I discovered is that Henry Hyde, the notorious conservative
I was just going to
congressman from
ask. Yeah, I was
Illinois,
just going to ask. Yeah.
yeah, so he's the one who gave the Hyde Amendment its name. Obviously, he was the face of it,
Just
right? It's
explain what the
mentioned in
Hyde
his
Amendment. Just
obituary.
yeah,
Right. So
explain
the
what it. Yeah.
the Hyde Amendment is a ban on federal funding of abortion. It first passed as a rider to an appropriations bill in 1976, and it has been renewed by every Congress every year since then. So it's passed as part of the annual appropriations process, which means Congress has had an opportunity every single year to not pass it. Um, and so Democrats, Republicans, everybody is implicated in the fact that the Hyde Amendment is still the law of the land today. What it does is ban federal funding of abortion, which means that people who are on Medicaid are not going to be able to get their abortions covered unless they live in a state that has voluntarily or by court order paid for abortions with state funds. And so there are a minority of states out there, including, my state in Massachusetts, where you can get your abortion paid for under Medicaid because of either state policies or a judicial decision.
How did
But
states go ahead, yeah.
but in most cases, people on Medicaid have not been able to get an abortion except in narrow circumstances. Those circumstances have changed, but often it's been rape or their life is in danger. And and so that was sort of the first major setback for abortion rights and really shaped the entire landscape in ways that we take for granted now.
How did states play a role in abortion policy? I mean, you have 50, some things in America are uniform, but many things are not. Take the DMV, for example, take education policy, and abortion policy is another thing that you have. Theoretically, you could have 50 separate policies, although, of course, they often rhyme depending on the type of leadership in the state. So, as this movement goes from victory to defeat in 49, 49, 51, 49 years, how did states play the role in um, in engineering that defeat?
Yeah, I mean, states played almost all the role, right? Like this is why when the Dobbs decision like sent abortion back to the states, it was like, oh, come on. Like what you're really doing is saying that states can go from like regulating this thing to death to just completely banning it, right? And so in some states like Mississippi, which had one abortion clinic, and which, you have waiting periods and you have all kinds of hurdles that the state has put up, banning abortion meant that that one abortion clinic had to close, right? And it meant that in hospitals, people are not getting the treatment that they would have gotten because doctors are afraid now of laws that make abortion a crime. But but states were I mean, hundreds and hundreds, a constant fire hose of anti-abortion laws, were passed and introduced in state legislatures. Over the years after Roe v. Wade became the law of the land. I mean, super creative, draconian, strange measures to, force women to undergo an ultrasound, force women to have the ultrasound described to them, force, women to wait 3 days after their initial appointment, force people to have the same consent form that you have a doctor be the same one who signed the consent form who performs the abortion. I mean, all these like draconian things that have nothing to do. There were laws that said like you have to have a certain type of doorknob in this abortion clinic, or, you have to renovate it to be an ambulatory surgery center. I mean, things that just regulated clinics out of business, forced them to close their doors. And, the courts were in charge of saying, yes, you can do this. No, you can't. Yes, it's an undue burden. No, it's not an undue burden. But states were often, they could get these laws through, often with not enough opposition from progressive groups because of under-resourcing of the sort of state-based infrastructure, which is another, problem I identify in the book, right? Conservatives, I think, by and large, have played a much more impressive state and local ground game, and the groups that are fighting anti-abortion legislation in the states did not have the resources or the manpower that their opponents had, and so it was very hard to stop these laws in the state legislatures. Instead, there was this reliance on blocking them in court, and that sometimes worked and sometimes it didn't.
There are the big and obvious suspects, and you interviewed a couple of them, particularly when it comes to the anti-abortion movement. Um, the people behind the Hyde Amendment, critical in your story. But as you indicate, grassroots activists seem to play an important, if not even a bigger role in all this. And, I'm reminded there's an abortion clinic near me, and I assume whenever abortions are taking place, there's sort of uh, protesters on one side and people helping the patients on the other side. Um, and you kind of argue that maybe those are the people who were the determining factor.
Those are the people that I was fascinated by because I think that history is shaped not just by the Supreme Court justices and the members of Congress, but by the activists who are doing the work outside of the public eye, changing the culture, making abortions happen or not happen one by one, right? And I felt like the story of how, Leonard Leo and Donald Trump stacked the Supreme Court, the story of how the Alliance Defending Freedom brought the case to the Supreme Court and overturned the Roe decision, like that story had been told. I wanted to know about the activists. And part of the reason I wanted to know is that it's kind of a hard truth to face that I think the anti-abortion movement built a much more impressive grassroots social movement than defenders of abortion rights. Like they out-organized us. And that's a painful truth to face, but I really wanted to face it head on in the book and ask like why and how did that happen? Um, because I think like it's a much more comforting narrative to be like, oh, they had tons of money and they had, all this power and they got the Supreme Court and, they gerrymandered everything, which is true. They did gerrymander everything and like they were anti-democratic in much of their approach. And yes, they had, we have the Electoral College. And yes, there's all sorts of like more comforting truths you could point to say like this is how they won. But I think one of them and the one that really fascinated me is like they had some really skillful activists and organizers on their side and what I found out when I dug into it is that a big part of the reason they succeeded is that they copied our playbook. They copied the left's playbook. They used the civil rights movement's language and rhetoric and more sense of moral righteousness and conviction. And they copy pasted that and reverse engineered it to build a civil rights movement for fetuses and to tear down women's rights and the rights of people of color and low income people in the process. And it was, quite a journey for them to get to that point. And so, yeah, I was fascinated in the people who like showed up at 4 a.m. with the fetus posters outside the clinic and were like already setting up by the time that my friends and I got there to escort people into the building when I was in college. Like, who were those people and what was driving them?
There is a fascinating stat about the 2016 election that I think about all the time, and that is that if only people who owned guns voted, Donald Trump would have won 50 states. And if only people without guns voted, Hillary Clinton would have won 49 states. So in other words, guns are the biggest predictor of someone's voting proclivity. Where does abortion rank as a predictor for how someone will vote?
This is a total side note, but it just brought this up for me that this is why I have a hard time when people talk about what we're facing right now as a civil war, right? That we're in a civil war between Democrats and Republicans, because I'm like, only one side is armed. It's not a civil war. We gotta call that something else. Um, but you're asking basically, like, could you say the same about abortion?
Right.
I think you probably could. Yeah, I'd be really interested to see that study because I think you probably could. And that's, the Republican Party has very much embraced and used abortion opportunistically. And the Democratic Party has, used pro-choice rhetoric too. I think like a lot of defenders of abortion rights would say that the Democratic Party has not been nearly as vociferous or shameless in defending abortion as the other side has been in eroding it. That's part of how we got to where we are. That support has often been qualified. It's often been under slogans like safe, legal, and rare. But I think if you look at the makeup of the voting base, now, I mean, there is a caveat there, which is like there is a majority of support for abortion rights in this country. And so you don't get to that without having a certain number of Republicans, principally Republican women, who are indeed pro-choice. And, I spent Election Day 2024 outside a polling station in Amarillo, Texas, where voters were voting on a ordinance that would have tried to stop people from traveling through the city or out of the city in order to get an abortion elsewhere. And that ordinance was defeated, even though Donald Trump won that area. And so I was talking to voters who were saying things like, "Yeah, I don't think that they should be allowed to restrict us. This measure goes too far. Like, we're women. We should like have this right." And then at the same time, they were voting for Donald Trump, the man who, had appointed the Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe v. Wade, and now abortion was, a crime in the state of Texas. So I was like,
So
how help me make sense of this, right?
so what's going to happen next? How do we look forward here and what are the prospects or what would the ingredients have to be for the victory that became a defeat to turn back into a victory again?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, I think if you ask the anti-abortion movement right now if they feel like they have won, they would say No, because yes, they've defeated Roe v. Wade, but the number of abortions has gone up. Abortion is more available and accessible in places like Texas and Alabama than it ever has been before. Now, that could all change depending on what the Supreme Court does next. But these shield laws that have been passed by 8 states that allow clinicians in those states to mail medication abortion to someone's door in Texas and Alabama, and then the funding available that has made it possible to do that for free. And by the way, you can go to Abortion Finder, I Need an A, or PlanCpills.org if you need to find out information about how to do that. Um, those have really changed the game and made abortion more accessible and available. And so they are kind of trying to ban the unstoppable in some ways. I think that's one thing. I think like there was sort of a victory that came about after this defeat for the abortion rights movement because they were able to get bold and bring about these shield laws. Of course, abortion remains, is not a constitutional right anymore. Of course, we know that there are women dying preventable deaths. We know this from ProPublica's reporting. There are women dying preventable deaths in hospitals because they're not getting care for rare complications of medication abortions or for miscarriages. We know that there are children growing up without their moms because of these abortion bans. And so this victory obviously is not complete. My view of sort of how we win is that the abortion rights movement needs to do what the opposition did and take a page out of their playbook. And, one of the major conclusions I think we can draw from how the anti-abortion movement won is that they did everything at the same time, right? They were incremental, they were step by step, they were strategic in their policy. They passed the laws that were tailor-made to have the Supreme Court say, chip away at abortion rights over time. But they also had, Operation Rescue, bringing the fight to the door of the clinic, chaining themselves up in parking lots, going dead weight and filling up the local jail. They had people who were much more militant, and often those contingents fought, but they were both doing it. And a robust social movement has all of that. I think the abortion rights movement has often underfunded and marginalized its bold and shameless side, right? And so I think there needs to be not just sort of incremental work of 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 advancing laws and policies that are going to, expand access to abortion. And we're seeing that happen. We're seeing more of that at the state and local level in the wake of the Dobbs decision, which is encouraging. There also needs to be bold, new strategies. There also need to be, you know, like efforts to sort of think big and imagine big and build the world that reproductive justice activists want. And that has to include not just the right to choose, but also the right to, raise a family. And we have to look at the fact that finances are a major reason why people choose abortion. And how do we build a world where everybody can have the children and afford the children that they want to have as well?
This is kind of a third rail question here, but I've got to ask it. I'm so curious. Much has been made about Barack Obama's effort to get Ruth Bader Ginsburg to retire before he left office so that he could appoint a replacement. Do you think it's fair to hold any disappointment with her decision to serve until she died?
Yes, I do. And I personally do. And I wish she had retired.
When she didn't retire and died during Trump's term, Um, what was the reaction among people who held her up as the pinnacle of what they wanted a justice to be?
I mean, I think it was heartbreaking on a personal level for many people. I think there were a lot of folks in the abortion rights space who idolized her. Certainly, she did a tremendous amount for the feminist movement, both in the example she set and in the decisions that she wrote. And I think, everyone is grateful on some level for those contributions. I think it is a heartbreaking reality that much of the good she did was undone by the simple fact that she didn't retire earlier than she did. And as a result, we lost Roe v. Wade, and that set us back, at least on the legal front. Um, and, I wish that that wasn't the case, that her legacy hadn't been, complicated by that timing.
What other rights could be done as a book similar to this one, a murder mystery couched as a mysterious death? Are there other rights that you think about that could get a similar treatment? Not
Oh, what
necessarily
an
by you, but
interesting idea. Yeah, why not all of them?
Or maybe all of them.
I think Miss Marple could solve any mystery. I mean, I don't think there's an Agatha Christie that's been written where she hasn't cracked the case in the end. So absolutely. I think you should pose another mystery for Miss Marple to solve and she'll get on it right away.
I mean, I think there'd be voting rights, uh, potentially. Well, voting rights would be one.
Yeah,
Um,
it's tricky these days because it's like Trump just says out loud what he's doing. And so it's like, is voting rights really a mystery? Or can we
yeah,
it's
right.
pretty clear why they want to do away with that and how they've done it, right? I think with abortion rights, like there were complicated and weird motives there that I didn't anticipate. There were things beyond just like they hate women and want to control women, which I do think is true on some level, right? Like I do think patriarchy is a major culprit here. But there were other motives and other kind of sneaky things hiding in the shadows that surprised me. And there were other people there to unmask. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a challenging thing these days because the people who are doing away with our rights seem to be doing so brazenly and unapologetically, and like they'll just tweet out what they're doing. And so maybe these things feel a little less mysterious, although I'm sure that there are hidden stories in the shadows there that could be uncovered too.
You dedicated the book to those who have died from abortion restrictions, the few whose names we do know, and the rest whose names we do not. Why was that particularly meaningful for you?
Well, I think in reporting this book, I saw just how much work it takes to prove that someone died as a direct result of anti-abortion policy. And sometimes that work was done, right? We know that Rosie Jimenez died as a result of the Hyde Amendment. We know that Becky Bell died in the 1980s as a result of a parental consent law. She was 17, couldn't get an abortion because she needed to ask her parents for permission. She didn't want to do that because she told a friend she loved them too much and she didn't want to disappoint them. So she got an unsafe abortion instead, died of pneumonia brought on by a massive infection. Her parents were heartbroken and then decided to tell her story, which is an incredibly courageous act. I mean, be this normal, non-political family living in Indiana, and then all of a sudden your daughter dies and you decide to dedicate the rest of your life to sharing the secret that she took with her to her grave. Um, and so knowing the enormous amount of courage, knowing the enormous amount of work that it took to uncover these deaths and prove that they had resulted from anti-abortion policy makes me feel like even though we don't have the data for it necessarily, there are other women out there who have died whose names we do not know. And seeing, ProPublica and their amazing reporting tracking down the people who have died in Georgia and Texas, the women whose children chase after women who look like them on the street shouting, "That's mommy," because their own mom died a totally preventable death from an abortion ban. These stories that they managed to uncover took a tremendous amount of work and resources from some of the top journalists in this country doing only this for years. And so we know there's more stories out there that have not been told. And I wanted to acknowledge those women as well.
Amy Littlefield, the author of Killers of Roe, My Investigation into the Mysterious Death of Abortion Rights. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Evan.
Check out the book and also her website, which is amylittlefield.com. Axelbankhistory.com was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes on it, our featured episodes, and a link to that Patreon page. So check out Nikki's work. I also want to invite listeners to that Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/axelbankhistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.